Hello, everyone. This is certainly an honor for the Countway Library of Medicine to be co-sponsoring the lecture series and also the tour that will be occurring on Saturday. The Francis A. Countway Library was created in 1960 as a result of a merger between two venerable Boston libraries. One was the Harvard Medical Library, which was founded in the 1780s. The other library was the Boston Medical Library, which was established in 1875. Both of these libraries brought to the merger marvelous collections. The Boston Medical Library brought to the alliance a wonderful collection of medical books, probably one of the largest collections of medical books in the country. The Harvard Medical Library brought to the table the archives of the Harvard Medical School, which date back to 1782, and a very good collection of archives and manuscript collections, the papers of many prominent Boston physicians who were affiliated with Harvard Medical School. And of course, we also have the Warren Anatomical Museum, one of the three major medical museums that were established in 19th century America, and still in existence. And those of you who are coming on the tour on Saturday will see this marvelous collection. So it's a great library located at the Harvard Medical School campus in the Longwood area, not too far from Fenway Park. So I hope you can come to visit the library and the Warren Museum when you have a chance. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Robert Gilbert. Bob is a specialist in the American presidency and has written many articles published in the United States and abroad, as well as 4 books. His 1998 book, The Mortal Presidency, Illness and Anguish in the White House, was chosen by Choice magazine as the outstanding academic book for 1998. It's an excellent book if anyone is interested in reading about illness in the White House. His most recent book, The Tormented President, Calvin Coolidge, Death and Clinical Depression, has been nominated by the J. David Greenstone Prize in Political History. Is that correct, Bob? Did I get that right? Okay. And so it is my great honor to introduce Robert Gilbert, Professor of Political Science at Northeastern University. Bob?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon and to have a chance to speak in this lecture series on the history of medicine. This is certainly an impressive setting in which to be speaking, magnificent and historic building. And I'm going to be speaking today about a man who certainly is a historic figure in the United States, but who very few would describe as being magnificent. Calvin Coolidge was President of the United States. He was not a native Massachusetts person. He moved to Massachusetts when he went to college, and he had a long political career in Massachusetts and eventually became governor of the Commonwealth. And as you know, he became vice president and also president of the United States. But even though he was Ronald Reagan's favorite president, and he was Ronald Reagan's favorite president because Reagan said he had done so little as President of the United States, and Reagan thought that this was an appropriate role model, that the government should not be intrusive and therefore the government should not be active. Despite Reagan's affection for Calvin Coolidge gets very little attention from the general public, very little attention from the mass media, and also very little attention from the academic community. And also he gets very little respect as a former President of the United States. Some of you may have heard about the Schlesinger poll of Presidents that's conducted now by Arthur Schlesinger and in previous years by his father, Arthur Schlesinger Sr. The most recent Schlesinger poll, the 1996 Schlesinger poll, which ranked 39 presidents, they asked 35 nationally known historians to rank the presidents. In 1996, they ranked 39 presidents, and they concluded that Calvin Coolidge should be ranked 30th among the 39, and they describe him as, quote, a below-average president. A year before this, the Writings McIver survey, which represents the thinking of 700 political scientists and historians throughout the United States, also evaluated 39 presidents, and their conclusion was that Calvin Coolidge should be ranked 31st among all the presidents, just 2 places above William Henry Harrison, who had served in office for only 30 days before his death. Scholars who mention Coolidge, and very few of them do, but scholars who mention Coolidge in their work typically do so in very unflattering terms. Coolidge is referred to as a figurehead president, as a do-nothing president, as a president who had no drive, as a president almost totally deficient in powers of leadership, as a spectator president, and as being lackadaisical. One prominent scholar complains that, quote, Coolidge voluntarily abdicated the leadership which the Constitution intended that the chief executive should exercise. Another wrote that Coolidge was the weakest of the modern-day weak presidents. And still another complained that, quote, Coolidge succeeded in his ambition to be the least president the United States has ever had. Even back in Coolidge's day, sometimes we think, 80 years ago, people might have reacted differently to him. But even back in Coolidge's day, prominent journalists debunked his presidency. One of them wrote, quote, Coolidge is distinguishable from the furniture only when he moves. Another complained that Coolidge's chief feat during 5 years and 7 months in the White House was to sleep more than any other president. Another claimed that Coolidge had cut the umbilical cord between thought and speech. And when one prominent literary figure was told in January 1933 that Coolidge died, she replied, how can they tell? So the preponderant judgment has been extremely negative with regard this son of Massachusetts who became President of the United States. But a closer analysis of Calvin Coolidge reveals that he is perhaps the most misunderstood president in history, and that his presidency was far more complex and far more tragic than anyone earlier realized. And as a matter of fact, Calvin Coolidge's presidential experiences fit very neatly into a lecture series that deals with the history of medicine, because if medical science was as advanced in the 1920s as it is today, American history might have turned out to be very different than it was. So let's go back and look at Calvin Coolidge, look at this man who is sometimes regarded as a historic oddity and who is really a historic tragedy. Despite things you might have heard about Calvin Coolidge, that he was raised in comfortable surroundings, and his family was wealthier than was the norm in that small Vermont community, Coolidge had a very sad childhood. His father was away from home frequently, and as a matter of fact, his absences began at the very time that Calvin was born, when his father was elected to the Vermont legislature and used to be away part of each year in Montpelier. And even when the legislature was not in session, Calvin's father was involved in a lot of business activities and so frequently was away from home. This meant that the child grew up really without his father being present, or at least without his father being present on a regular basis. Not surprisingly, Coolidge was extremely close to his mother. He was entrusted to the care of his mother and his very stern maternal grandmother. And he became extremely close to both of them, but in particular close to his mother. He idolized his mother, and as a matter of fact, throughout his entire life, he carried a picture of his mother in a locket that he carried in the inside of his suit jacket. And on the day he died, as a matter of fact, he still had the locket with his mother's picture in his pocket. He always carried it close to his heart because he was so close to his mother. Coolidge's mother died when she was 39 years old of tuberculosis, and Calvin was only 12 years old at the time. And so he lost the most important person in his life when he was 12 years old. And he writes in his autobiography, and so many people criticize Coolidge's autobiography, and they make fun of Coolidge's autobiography, and they say if you read it, there's nothing really important in it. You don't get any sense of the man when you read his autobiography. But these people should read it more closely, because Coolidge does, in his autobiography, open up and reveal his feelings about a number of things. And one of the things that he opens up about is his mother. And he describes the funeral of his mother. And he said, "We buried her amidst the blustery snows of Vermont, of a cold, bitter Vermont winter." And then he writes, "The greatest grief that can come to a boy came to me. Life was never to seem the same again." After Victoria Coolidge's death, Calvin was lethargic. He lost his appetite. He would just pick at his food. His family thought that he might die as well. They thought that he might develop the tuberculosis, and perhaps he was developing the tuberculosis that had killed his mother. They thought this in particular because he complained frequently of not being able to breathe, a symptom very similar to his mother's difficulties in the final days of her life. Neighbors used to see Coolidge going down to the cemetery in Plymouth, Vermont, all by himself, even in the dead of winter, to visit his mother's grave. And in his autobiography, he wrote, "I used to go there to commune with her." He said, "I used to commune with her all the time, and it always gave me comfort to be close to her final resting place." About 3.5 years after his mother died, Coolidge's only sister, with whom he was also very close, Abigail, died when she was 13 years old, and Coolidge was about 17. She died of appendicitis, probably of appendicitis. And so now not only did he lose his mother, who was his closest, the closest person in his life, but the person who replaced his mother as his closest companion, his sister, was now taken away as well. Coolidge was heartbroken. He repressed his emotions. In the Coolidge family, emotions always had to be repressed. He held in his emotions. He couldn't cry in public. And some psychiatrists would say that repressing emotions at such times is likely to lead to unresolved grief. In addition to the sadness of his childhood, several other things emerge very forcefully from this particular period of Coolidge's life. Despite his image now as a lazy, lackadaisical president, Coolidge, as a boy, who had always been seen as being industrious, hardworking, and reliable. His father wrote, for example, "Whenever I tell my son to do anything, and then I go away for the day, when I come back, I'm always 100% certain that he will have done what I told him to do. He is the most reliable person that you can imagine." He impressed everyone with his hard work and his diligence. When he was a student at Amherst College, I mentioned that he went to Amherst College a few minutes ago, he used to sometimes stay in Amherst and vacation times. At Thanksgiving, he would not go home because he would tell his family back home, "I'll fall behind in my work if I waste time celebrating the holiday." And he would stay by himself in Amherst. All the other students would be gone because he would be trying to do his work. His work was the most important thing to him. And this is this lazy, lackadaisical president we hear about. He had a very, very strong work ethic. When he was a law student in Northampton, Massachusetts, he was described by the law partners in the firm where he worked as, quote, "a hog for work." A hog for work. He was always working. One of the partners said he worked like the devil as a student of the law. As mayor of Northampton, Massachusetts, he was seen as one of the hardworking mayors in the history of the city. He visited every single school and public facility in the city of Northampton. on fact-finding tours, and established a reputation as being one of the most hardworking governors in the history of the city. As a member of the state legislature, one of his colleagues said of him, quote, "Every night while the rest of us were out having a good time, Calvin Coolidge was home studying bills. He took his job very seriously." As president of the state Senate, Coolidge dominated that body by the force of his own personality and was widely regarded as a first-rate power. He was described by the Boston Globe, for example, as a first-rate power. This is this weak, vacillating president who dominated the state legislature here in Massachusetts. As governor of Massachusetts, he was an effective leader, ranked very, very highly. He put in long hours at his desk from early in the morning until early evening every day, and was described widely as, quote, "a working governor if ever there was one." As Vice President of the United States in 1920, he was nominated by the Republican Party to be Warren Harding's running mate. Coolidge was seen as, quote, "the workhorse of the Harding administration." And if you look back at that particular period in history, a number of Washington officials commented on how unusual it was to have a vice president who worked as hard as he did. One of them said most vice presidents simply go to social events in Washington. They don't really have too much to do. He said, but at this particular time in American history, it's different. This is a vice president who's different. This is a vice president who works hard. In August of 1923, Calvin Coolidge became president on the sudden death of Warren Harding. As soon as he became president, he moved quickly to take control of the executive branch of government and to put the stamp of his own personality on the office that he now occupied. He insisted, for example, and probably some of you are aware of this, he insisted that his father should administer the oath of office to him rather than a judge. He wanted his father to do it. His father was a justice of the peace, and he believed that this would be an image that the country could identify with, a president being sworn into office by his own father in a farmhouse in Vermont, rather than being sworn into office by a federal judge in a very grandiose location. We know now, however, that the swearing in by his father was not sufficient, and Coolidge was sworn in by a federal judge a couple of weeks after he had become president, but he insisted that the judge not reveal this because it would ruin the image that he wanted to create of this very down-to-earth, very hardworking, very common president, a president who could relate to the common man. He stunned the person who was in charge of coordinating Warren Harding's funeral, General Pershing, by giving him specific instructions on how the funeral should be handled. He said, "This is the way I want it to be done, and so I expect you to do it this way." He instituted regular press conferences. He had his first press conference, as a matter of fact, before he even reached Washington. When Harding died, Coolidge was visiting his father in Vermont. And on the train ride back to Washington, Coolidge held a press conference for the press and impressed reporters with the degree of knowledge that he had and with his political astuteness. As a matter of fact, when he got back to Washington and held a press conference, at the end of the press conference, the press burst into applause. They were so impressed. They described him as the most communicative president that they had encountered. This is the president who we now call Silent Cal. And this was the reaction that the press had to him. Coolidge worked 6 and often 7 days a week in his first year as president, beginning in the morning and going into the early evening, at times 7 days a week. Coolidge launched a series of breakfasts and dinners with members of Congress of all political leanings, not only Republicans but Democrats, in order to convince them to adopt his programs. Acting against the advice of his own Attorney General, Coolidge pardoned the 30 people who had been arrested for violating the sedition laws during World War I, and he had them released from prison because the people in Congress who wanted him to do this, Coolidge felt, would be strong political allies. And so he did this as a way of building a bridge to the legislative branch and convincing the legislative branch to, again, enact his programs. One of the first things he did as a new president was to convene a meeting at the White House for the governors of all the states so that he could discuss with the governors the narcotics, immigration, and prohibition laws. He also set up a two-person committee to investigate the scandals associated with the Harding administration. And he announced to the press, quote, "If there is any civil liability, it will be enforced. If there is any fraud, it will be revealed. If there are any contracts that are illegal, they will be canceled. If there is any guilt, it will be punished." He then fired Harding's Attorney General, around whom rumors of impropriety swirled. In foreign policy, Coolidge restored diplomatic relations with Mexico, which he referred to as our sister republic, and he asked Congress to provide funds to settle claims resulting from the 1914 American invasion. Our relations with Mexico were never better than during the early years with Calvin Coolidge. In September of 1923, he responded to a natural disaster, a typhoon, that had killed 130,000 people in Japan by dispatching, on his own authority, the Pacific Fleet of the United States in an effort to bring help to the people of Japan. And he acted so quickly that the American ships arrived on the scene even before the Japanese ships arrived there. Probably the most notable thing that Calvin Coolidge did during his first year in office was to deliver a State of the Union address that was, in every respect, a stunning document. In December of 1923, Calvin Coolidge traveled to Congress, and this was unusual at the time. Earlier presidents, now presidents, do it all the time. In Coolidge's day and during the 1800s, presidents never would deliver a State of the Union address in person. They would send the speech to be read to each House of Congress by clerks. Well, Coolidge decided to speak in person to Congress, and in that joint session, he made a large number of legislative requests, and frankly, amazing legislative requests for someone who has been described as so conservative and so much oriented toward a big business. He's quoted, as you know, for saying the business of America is business. In that speech, he asked for a tax cut, and he's famous for that, and Ronald Reagan liked him for this. But he asked for much more than a tax cut, and the other things that he asked for have never gotten much attention, and they really should. In that speech, Coolidge requested the enactment of environmental legislation, and now this is, remember, 1923. He asked for the enactment of environmental legislation. He asked for the expansion of health benefits for veterans. He asked for the passage of a constitutional amendment limiting child labor. He asked for the creation of a separate cabinet-level Department of Education and Welfare. He asked for the expansion of the civil service system in the United States. He asked for the reorganization of the U.S. Foreign Service. He asked for the creation of a new reforestation policy in the United States. He asked for funds to establish reformatories for women and young men who were serving their first prison sentence. He asked for the funding of medical courses at Howard University. And also he asked for the establishment of a permanent court of international justice. By the time Congress adjourned in June of 1924, most of Coolidge's proposals had been adopted. The Foreign Service was reorganized, taxes were cut, veterans' benefits were expanded, reformatories for women and young men were authorized, an oil slick law was enacted, and a new reforestation policy was established for the United States. Coolidge's legislative record then, in his first year, was more than respectable. In June of 1924, Calvin Coolidge was overwhelmingly nominated at the Republican Convention for President of the United States. This was the greatest political triumph of his life. And yet, within a matter of days, it would turn to ashes. And strangely enough, it all began with a game of tennis. On June 30th, Coolidge's two sons, who had come home 3 days before from school, they both were at boarding school in Pennsylvania, Mercersburg Academy, and they came home for their summer vacation. And when they arrived on Friday, they went to a baseball game. The family was very, very happy to be reunited. One of the sons was 18 years old. The other one was 16. The oldest son was John. The youngest son was Calvin, named after his father. And then they went on an overnight trip on the presidential yacht up the Potomac River, which the two boys enjoyed. And then on Monday they returned to Washington, and the president went back to work in the Oval Office. And his two sons decided to play tennis on the White House tennis courts, ironically with the two White House physicians. And the younger boy, Calvin, was so anxious to play that day that he wore sneakers but no socks. And a blister developed on one of his toes, but he continued to play. And he played the next day as well. On July the 2nd, the boy didn't feel well. And when the White House physician, Joel Boone, examined him, he immediately became alarmed. The blister on the third toe of young Calvin's right foot was about the size of the doctor's thumbnail and much darker in color than usual. And Dr. Boone became even more concerned, if not alarmed, when he saw red streaks running up the boy's leg. Laboratory tests soon revealed that Calvin Jr. had a serious staph infection and was suffering from pathogenic blood poisoning. It also revealed that his system was not fighting this infection effectively. Doctors were brought in from around the country, and they fought for several days to save the boy's life. He was hospitalized. The President and First Lady moved into the hospital to be close to their son. The President, of course, was completely distracted by his illness. On the evening of July 7th, 1924, Dr. Albert Comer, a physician from Philadelphia who had been brought in to try to help young Calvin, told the President that his son was rapidly dying. And he later reported, and he didn't report this for many years, he didn't report it until he wrote an article that appeared in Time magazine in 1955, so he kept this secret for more than 30 years. But in 1955, he wrote an article that appeared in Time magazine, and he said, when I told the President that his son was dying, he became hysterical. He took his son into his arms and began to shout that he would soon join him and his mother, the boy's grandmother, in heaven. Comer described this episode as, quote, the most touching and heartrending experience of my entire professional career. At 10:20 that night, Calvin Jr. died. Ironically, one of the ironies of history is that while Calvin Coolidge was dying, the Democratic Party was meeting in New York in Madison Square Garden to nominate the Democratic ticket that would run against Coolidge. And when they learned that Coolidge's son was in such dire straits, they began reading bulletins to the delegates every hour that they, even though it was the opposition party, they would read a bulletin on the president's son's condition. And at 10 o'clock or at 10:30, the first announcement of the young boy's death came at the Democratic Convention when the presiding officer announced that the president's son had died. And then the Democratic Convention immediately adjourned out of respect for the president. So the first public announcement came from the opposition party that was meeting to nominate a candidate to run against Coolidge, which is I think, rather ironic. Young Calvin's body was taken to the White House, where it lay in state, and where throngs of Washington officialdom paid their respects. Dr. Boone, who has written a voluminous autobiography, it's never been published, but it's available at the Library of Congress. But Dr. Boone later reported that hours after young Calvin's wake had ended, the president came downstairs from the living quarters of the White House dressed in a bathrobe and stood for a long time at his son's open casket, gazing at his face and gently stroking his hair. In 1997, I had the wonderful opportunity of interviewing for several hours Calvin Coolidge's surviving son, John Coolidge. He was the one who was playing tennis with Calvin when he developed a blister on his toe. When I spoke with him in 1997, he was almost 90 years old, but his memory was as sharp as a tack. He died 2 years ago. His memory was as sharp as a tack, and he remembered his brother's funeral very, very clearly. And he said to me, when my brother's casket was closed, in preparation for moving it from the White House and taking it to Northampton for funeral services and then up to Vermont for burial, he said, my father burst into tears. My father, the president, burst into tears and began sobbing, they're taking our boy away. And he said, this was the only time in my entire life when I saw my father cry. He said, it was the only time in my life when I saw any emotion from my father. And he said, I will never forget it as long as I live. And he was almost 90 at the time. After the funeral, the president's aides and some of his friends and even his own father, his father never liked to go to the White House, but his father went to the White House for 2 weeks. And all of these people tried to console the president, but the president was beyond consolation. Visitors to his office reported that he would break down and cry when he would discuss his son, that he would tell visitors that every time I look out that window, I see my son playing tennis on the White House tennis courts, and that he couldn't believe what had happened, that this boy had died. One of his friends said the president's appearance was like the bleak desolation of cold November rain beating on gray Vermont granite. Ironically, Grace Coolidge had a very different response to her son's death. Obviously, she was very heartbroken over the boy's death, but she was much more optimistic, and she wrote letters to friends saying, when I left the cemetery after we buried Calvin, I had such tremendous peace. I was at peace because I knew that my boy was safe, and I knew that my boy was in heaven, and that he was happy in heaven. But President Coolidge's reaction was not that optimistic and not that positive. The American Psychiatric Association and the National Institutes of Health have specified symptoms of a major depressive episode. These symptoms include insomnia or hypersomnia, sleeping constantly or not being able to sleep at all, changes in appetite, mostly loss of appetite, but sometimes gaining appetite, needing a great deal, decreased energy, feelings of guilt, recurrent thoughts of death, indecisiveness, the loss of interest in nearly all normal activities, complaints of bodily indispositions, increased irritability, spitefulness, suspiciousness, and deterioration in work performance. After his son's death, Calvin Coolidge showed signs of every single one of these symptoms. He began to sleep as many as 15 hours a day out of every 24. This he had never done before. He took long breaks in the afternoon, sometimes sleeping 4 hours in the afternoon. And when he would go back to his desk, his secretary would frequently find him with his head on the desk asleep. He ate incessantly, sometimes even to the point of abdominal distress. He complained of exhaustion, of feeling much older than his years. He was 52. He often seemed to be on the verge of collapse. Also, he experienced severe guilt feelings, writing in his autobiography that if I had not been president, my son would not have been on the White House tennis courts playing tennis, and he never would have developed this blister on his toe. He began to speak about his own death, even though he was only 52, in December, and write letters to people about the expectation that he would soon die. In December of 1925, for example, he wrote to his father and told him that the two of them would soon be reunited with his mother and his father's wife, and with their son, and with Abby, his sister, in heaven. And he said to his father, maybe you'll get there a little bit before me, but soon we'll all be in heaven together. He complained often of feeling ill, of not being able to breathe, just as he had felt after his mother had died, and of having severe indigestion. His irritability became explosive, and he would fly into rages at staff members and Secret Service agents, often for reasons that were petty or inconsequential. The chief White House usher has written a book, as a matter of fact, and he said, I served 9 different presidents in the White House. And he said the temper tantrums that Calvin Coolidge would throw in the White House were the worst I ever saw. And he said all staff members were absolutely terrified of him because he would explode into rage at the most inconsequential of reasons. He treated his wife very badly, sometimes flying into rages at her in the presence of other people. In the White House, in the presence of other people. Dr. Boone writes about episodes where Coolidge would, for absolutely no reason or for reasons that were completely unclear, literally scream at his wife, humiliate his wife in public. He was also very mean-spirited toward his surviving son, John, so mean-spirited and so nasty to this boy that young John described the White House as a penitentiary and said that I'm glad to get away. Every time I leave, I'm happy. Young John Coolidge, asked his mother, the First Lady, on one occasion, how do you put up with Father? How do you put up with Father? Maybe he's so difficult to deal with. Coolidge also showed spitefulness and rudeness to staff members, and even something of a sadistic trait. President Coolidge liked to go fishing, but he never liked to bait the fishhook himself, and he used to insist that the Secret Service agents bait the fishhook. And one observer reports that when a Secret Service agent was baiting the fishhook, the president deliberately yanked the line, trying to embed the fishhook in the agent's hand. And the commentator said the president thought this was funny, that he would do something like this. Most staff members regarded the president as rude, unpleasant, selfish, and unappreciative. Coolidge apparently even was suspicious of his wife, believing in 1927 that she had become romantically involved with the Secret Service agent, and summarily removing the agent from his job and sending him back to Washington, replacing him as Grace Coolidge's bodyguard. More serious, of course, was that Coolidge essentially abdicated his presidential responsibilities after his son died. He now shied away from interactions with Congress, made very few and very modest legislative requests, and indicated basically that Congress should determine the legislative agenda for itself because it was closer to the people. His annual messages became leaner and leaner and were never again delivered in person, as he had done with his first address. He withdrew from interactions with his own cabinet, telling cabinet members to handle the affairs of their own departments of government without help or guidance from him. On one occasion, when the Secretary of Labor asked him for his opinion on a subject facing the Labor Department, Coolidge said, "If you can't do your job, I'll fire you and get somebody else to do it." The lifetime pattern of hard work that he had always shown before was now abandoned, as his workday shrank to about 4 hours each day. No longer was he a hog for work, as he was described before. No longer was he the workhorse of the administration, the Harding administration, or any kind of a workhorse as he had been described before. No longer did he have any interest in foreign policy. He told the Secretary of State on one occasion, "I don't know anything about this matter. You do. You're in charge. You handle the problem, and I'll back you up." No longer were his press conferences a showcase for an informed, involved leader. Even though Coolidge insisted that questions be submitted in advance, his answers became vaguer and vaguer. Let me give you very quickly an example of what I mean. In November of 1924, a few months after his son died, he was asked a question about Nicaragua. He had sent troops into Nicaragua. Coolidge, as commander-in-chief, had sent troops into Nicaragua. And our reporter said, "What's happening in Nicaragua?" And this is what the president's answer was. And he had the question in advance, so he knew it was coming. But this was his answer. Quote, "I haven't any great detailed or precise information about Nicaragua. I know that there had been some trouble there, and it was my impression that we had sent some Marines in to guard the legation, and that the difficulty was in relation to a presidential election. As I have heard nothing about this from the State Department for some time, I have taken for granted that the situation is all cleared up. I think this is the case, but I don't have any definite information." When he was asked a question about agriculture legislation, agriculture was a great concern to him during his first year. When he was asked a question about agriculture legislation, Coolidge responded, "I don't know as I can make any particular comment about the rejection of the conference agriculture bills. I don't know enough about the details of those bills to discuss the details with any intelligence." More ominous, as economic storm clouds were gathering, Coolidge did nothing. As you all know, the Great Depression hit the United States and the rest of the world about 6 months after Coolidge left office. As the economic storm clouds were beginning to gather, Coolidge did essentially nothing, and also revealed in his press conference remarks a stunning degree of disinterest and ignorance about the rampant stock speculation that was ravaging the economy. In 1928, when Congress was considering legislation to rein in such speculation, and when Coolidge's aides, for example, Herbert Hoover, was urging him to push Congress to enact this legislation, Coolidge told the press, quote, "I have no information relative to proposed legislation about loans on securities. I saw by the press that there was a bill pending in the House or the Senate. I don't know what it is or what its provisions are or what the discussion of it has been." These words have often been seen as the sign of an absentee, incompetent, and negligent president. But set within the context of his earlier political career, and set within the context of his first year as president, and judged with all the other behavior changes that engulfed his life, what we really have here is a disabled president, not an incompetent one, but a disabled president, one suffering from a paralyzing and persistent clinical depression. Clinical depression was little understood in the 1920s. It's not even well understood today. But those closest to Coolidge in the 1920s saw a dramatic change in his life after his son died. His wife, Grace Coolidge, has written, quote, "The president, quote, lost his zest for living after July 7th, 1924. His son, John, told me that, quote, my father was never the same again after my brother died." His White House physician, Joel Boone, described Coolidge in that autobiography that I mentioned a few minutes ago as showing many signs of, quote, mental disturbance and of being temperamentally deranged. His secretary told his doctors that in his view, the president was definitely showing signs of, quote, mental illness. The chief usher at the White House reported that White House employees who came into contact with the president noticed that he was, quote, highly disturbed. His Secret Service agent, his principal Secret Service agent, simply described Coolidge as, quote, a very changed man after July 1924. And Coolidge himself, in that autobiography that so many people see as being so empty, Coolidge himself explained the change that had taken place when he wrote two things about his son. Coolidge had always wanted to be president of the United States, and now he had achieved being president, and now he was the most powerful person in the world, and now he could send the fleet to Japan if he wanted to, and now his subordinates did whatever he told them to do. But Coolidge in his autobiography wrote, "The thing I most wanted to do of all was the one thing that I couldn't do." He said, "My son was begging me to make him well, and I couldn't do it. I had to stand by while he died." The second thing that he mentions in his autobiography about his presidency is this, and I quote from the words of the president themselves: "The power and the glory of the presidency went with him. When Calvin Jr. died, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him." Now, Coolidge's psychological breakdown was a tremendous problem in his time and would still pose tremendous stress for the political system today. This is because mental illness still carries a great stigma and is subject to so much misunderstanding. One thing that I think should be considered in contemporary politics, building on the Coolidge experience, is that the White House medical unit, which now has 18 employees, it's a much larger unit than most people realize, 5 physicians, 5 nurses, etc., should also have assigned to it a mental health specialist so that this person could watch the president at close range, could interact with the president very, very frequently, so that he or she might be able to detect signs of psychological dysfunction or behavior modification. Everyone saw the change in Coolidge, but no one at the time was in a position to diagnose it accurately for what it was. A person who is a mental health specialist who is assigned to the White House on a regular basis could not only view the president and observe the president, but also could provide assistance to the presidential staff, members of the president's family, helping them deal with substance abuse, excess drinking, for example. And all of this could be done within the White House itself in a way that confidentiality could be maintained. Now, let me just conclude by returning to something I said at the beginning of this talk. If medical science had been as advanced in 1924 as it is today, think of how history would have changed. Think of how history would have changed. Calvin Jr. would have received medication that almost certainly would have saved his life. These kinds of infections today are treatable. In those days, they were not. If Calvin Coolidge Jr.'s life had been saved, President Coolidge's presidency would not have been destroyed. President Coolidge would have continued to function as an effective president, almost certainly for the next 4 years. And if by any chance Calvin Jr. had not responded to this medication, and if he had died, and if his father had become clinically depressed, in today's world, there are medications that could have contained the president's clinical depression, so that his bereavement would have followed the normal patterns of bereavement rather than becoming unending. So the country then would have been spared 4 years of severely disabled leadership. But unfortunately, medical science had not progressed to that degree in the 1920s. Instead, the boy was dead within a week, and instead his father's presidency essentially died with him. So the death of a 16-year-old boy, sad in itself, became in a very real sense a national tragedy. Thank you very much, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Thank you.
Was there any public discussion about the change in the president's personality?
No. There was no public announcements, no public discussions, and many people are surprised. When I wrote the book on Calvin Coolidge, the tormented president, Calvin Coolidge, death and clinical depression, some people, said to me, "How is it that no one noticed this? How come the public never noticed this? Why was this never publicly discussed?" Because the change was so dramatic. And the reason for that, well, there are several reasons for that. One reason is President Coolidge had always been very dour in the way he appeared in public. He was never a glad-handing politician. He always looked somber and very, very serious. He was all through his life, he was a very, very serious person. And so people thought that there was basically no change. They would just see the outward Coolidge, that he looked very, very somber, but they wouldn't see what was happening inside the president. The people who could see what was happening inside the president, his intimates in the White House, a great number of them commented on the tremendous transformation that had taken place. The chief usher at the White House, I mentioned him, his name was Ike Hoover. And Ike Hoover describes Coolidge's inauguration in 1924. And there's a picture of Coolidge's inauguration in 1924, and he's riding in the limousine, and the big crowds are on the streets in Washington, and all the people are applauding Calvin Coolidge. And Grace Coolidge is smiling and waving to the crowds. And President Coolidge is staring straight ahead with not even a smile on his face. And Ike Hoover said, the president seemed to the country to be unappreciative of the tremendous outpouring of affection that they were getting, that he was getting. The people were applauding and the people were cheering. And the president's demeanor was so somber and so serious that he seemed to the country to be unappreciative of what the people were doing. But then he said the people that came into contact in the White House with the president knew that he was showing many signs of severe mental illness. So this is why I think it was so concealed in the 1920s. And obviously, this is something that the White House is not likely to go public with. People are very upset if the president's mental processes are unbalanced. President Eisenhower, a more recent president, President Eisenhower, as you might remember, had a very serious heart attack in 1955, a massive heart attack in 1955. He almost died, as a matter of fact. And in 1957, he had a minor stroke. And he got over the minor stroke very, very quickly. But the reaction to the minor stroke was much more serious than the reaction to the heart attack. When he had the stroke, public officials, senators, for example, and newspapers urged that he resign, urged that he leave the presidency, because the stroke, they feared, would affect his mental capacity, whereas the heart attack would affect him physically. And so this is in the 1950s. Mental illness is much more difficult for the political system to deal with because it really undermines a president's leadership. Yes?
How many years did he have after his presidency? Was it any better for him? Did he ever find any peace in his life?
He died 4 years later. He was only 60 years old when he died. Throughout the reigning years of his life, he was very, very sad, very, very withdrawn, refused to give any speeches, refused to make any public appearances in the 1932 presidential campaign. President Hoover begged him to campaign for him, begged him to make appearances, and begged him to give radio speeches and so on. He refused to make any appearances. He gave one radio address and then said to Hoover, "No more. I'm not going to do any more." He died very, very suddenly. He went to the office one morning. He became a partner in a law firm in Northampton again. And he went to the office. He didn't feel well in the office. He came home, and Grace Coolidge was leaving the house. She was going shopping, and he said to her, "Have a good day." And he had an assistant with him. And Coolidge, he was talking to the assistant. They were walking around the property. The assistant said the former president showed no sign of being ill. And then the president said, I forgot to shave this morning. I have to go upstairs and shave. And he went upstairs, and a little while after he went upstairs, Grace Coolidge came home and went upstairs and found him dead on the floor of his dressing room. So he had a very, very short life at the end, only 60 years old.
Thank you, but I was going to ask when he died and what they said he died from, but both questions have been answered now.
He had apparently a massive heart attack in January of 1933, a massive heart attack.